Welcome back to The Deep Dive, the show that cuts through the noise and gets you well informed fast. Today, we're taking a truly epic journey, one that spans millennia and touches on the very nature of power, diplomacy, and perception. Our mission is to deeply understand China, not just as it is today, but through the profound lens of its history and strategic thought, guided by one of the most significant diplomatic figures of our time, Henry Kissinger.
That's right. For this deep dive, we've extracted key insights from Kissinger's extensive work on China. This isn't just a historical account. It's, a masterwork based on over 50 visits to China and conversations with 4 generations of its leaders. What's truly fascinating here is how Kissinger, an American reflecting on peace, largely from an American perspective, endeavors to explain the conceptual way the Chinese think about problems of peace, war, and international order. He meticulously contrasts this with the more pragmatic, often case-by-case American approach. It's about understanding why different histories and cultures produce divergent conclusions, and why that deep understanding is absolutely critical for navigating the 21st century.
As we unpack Kissinger's insights, I think you'll find some truly surprising connections between China's ancient past and its present-day strategies. You're about to get a masterclass in how China's deep history still shapes its actions, the dramatic clashes of civilizations it has endured, and the pivotal, often unexpected moments in its relationship with the United States. Get ready for some profound aha moments that will reshape your understanding. Okay, let's unpack this. To truly grasp China, we first have to travel back, far back into its most ancient foundations. Because this deep dive immediately makes it clear that China isn't just a civilization. In its own eyes and for much of its history, it has often been civilization itself. How does this singular self-perception emerge, and what are its deep, enduring foundations?
This is where we confront China's unique claim. A continuous civilization spanning millennia, intimately linked to its ancient past and classical principles of strategy and statesmanship. This continuity isn't just a point of pride or a historical curiosity. It's a foundational element of their strategic thinking and worldview. Think about this. The 19th century missionary Abbe Regis Everest Hooke observed no infancy in Chinese civilization. He noted they seem to have been always living in the same stage of advancement as in the present day. He found no well-defined point of departure, no linear progression or decay as seen in other nations. They seem to have simply been, existing in a state of advanced, unbroken continuity. This profound sense of a single, continuous culture is almost unparalleled.
That's a profound thought. So, if they saw themselves as the civilization, how did this singular self-perception manifest in their historical understanding of their place in the wider world?
Historically, China developed what's known as the all under heaven concept. They saw their emperor not just as a ruler of a nation, but as the pinnacle of a universal political hierarchy, with all other rulers serving as theoretical vassals. Chinese language, culture, and institutions were considered the very hallmarks of civilization, the natural order of things. This wasn't merely an assertion, but was largely recognized by most neighboring states, creating an East Asian international system of remarkable durability, often referred to as the tributary system.
And a really tangible example of this all-under-heaven concept, this idea of cultural rather than military supremacy, is found in the incredible voyages of Zheng He. These weren't about conquest, were they?
Precisely. Take Zheng, his grand maritime voyages during the Ming Dynasty in the 15th century. He was a singular figure, a Chinese Muslim eunuch, leading expeditions on monumental ships far larger and more advanced than anything in Europe at the time. But his missions were fundamentally unlike any European exploration that would follow centuries later. They were not about territorial conquest, nor about establishing colonies or trading outposts for material gain. Instead, Zheng He's fleets formally proclaimed China's magnificence, bestowed lavish gifts on the rulers he encountered, and invited foreign rulers to travel in person or send envoys to China. Once there, they were expected to perform the kowtow, a ritual acknowledging the emperor's superiority. A gesture of deference that literally involves prostrating oneself and touching the forehead to the ground, thereby extending the metaphysical limits of all under heaven. This was essentially China's version of soft power long before the term existed, driven by a desire for cosmological order and acknowledgement of superiority rather than material gain like resources or colonies. He returned with lavish gifts, often called tribute, but never claimed territory or resources for China. He even brought back a giraffe.
So this was about demonstrating unparalleled magnificence and inviting others into a Chinese-centric order, not about force or colonization. That's a stark contrast to how Western powers would later approach exploration and trade. It sounds like this profound sense of splendid isolation truly shaped Chinese elites.
It absolutely did. Chinese elites became accustomed to the notion that China was unique, not just a great civilization, among others, but the civilization itself. A British translator in 1850 noted how China's exclusion of foreigners and confinement to their own country has, by depriving them of all opportunities of making comparisons, sadly circumscribed their ideas. They are thus totally unable to free themselves from the dominion of association and judge everything by rules of purely Chinese convention. Unlike the United States, for instance, which claimed universal applicability for its values and institutions and often sought to spread them globally, China typically confined itself to controlling barbarians immediately at its doorstep, striving for tributary states like Korea to recognize its special status. Remote barbarians like Europeans were met with friendly if condescending aloofness and little interest in conversion. The Ming Dynasty emperor in 1372 articulated this, saying, "Countries of the Western Ocean are rightly called distant regions. They come to us across the seas. Regardless of their numbers, we treat them on the principle of those who come modestly are sent off generously." In official Chinese records, foreign envoys did not come to the imperial court to engage in negotiations. They came to be transformed by the emperor's civilizing influence. When the Chinese court deigned to send envoys abroad, they were not diplomats, but heavenly envoys, embodying the universal authority of the emperor.
So we've established this incredible sense of self-belief and cosmic order, but where did the actual operating instructions for this civilization come from? How did these ancient Chinese principles translate into the day-to-day workings of society and even their approach to power? That's where we need to look at something like Confucianism. It seems to offer a totally different drive for public service than, say, Western ideas of progress.
Indeed, the predominant values of Chinese society were derived from Confucius, who lived from 551 to 479 BC, during a tumultuous period of political upheaval known as the Warring States period. He sought to restore order and harmony to a chaotic world. The traditional Chinese impetus for public service, rooted in Confucian ideals, was rectification, the idea of restoring order to a society that had fallen into imbalance by recovering profound, neglected truths. Confucius himself saw his mission as recovering these ancient wisdoms to restore society to a golden age. This contrasts sharply with the Western ideal of progress, which generally implies a linear forward movement towards something new and better, a constant striving for innovation. China fundamentally sought to return to a prior perfected state of harmony rather than invent a completely new one.
Okay, right. And here's where it gets really interesting, because this ancient Chinese thinking isn't just about philosophy or world order. It's profoundly about strategy, especially with someone like Sun Tzu. Given what you've described about this focus on harmony and indirect influence, how does his approach to warfare differ so fundamentally from Western military thought?
Sun Tzu's The Art of War, unlike Western military treatises by figures such as Karl von Clausewitz, who often viewed war as a distinct activity, fundamentally merges strategy with politics and psychological warfare. His core insight is truly profound. The victorious army is victorious first and seeks battle later. The defeated army does battle first and seeks victory later. Think about that for a moment. This means building such a dominant political and psychological position that the outcome of a conflict becomes a foregone conclusion. Victory for Sun Tzu is truly tested by victories where battles have become unnecessary. The ultimate triumph is to prevail without ever drawing a sword or firing a shot.
So it's about winning before you even fight. That sounds incredibly efficient, almost like a mental chess game played on a grand scale. But does that indirect approach ever have its weaknesses? Are there situations where a more direct, perhaps Western approach might be necessary?
That's a fair question, and a critical one for understanding the clash of civilizations we'll discuss later. But for Sun Tzu, the indirect path was seen as both more humane and more effective. To achieve victory without fighting, subterfuge and misinformation are key. Sun Tzu counseled, "When able, feign inability. When deploying troops, appear not to be. When near, appear far. When far, appear near." The goal is to induce your opponent into accomplishing your aims, or to force them into such an impossible position that they surrender unharmed. A victory achieved indirectly through deception or manipulation is seen as more humane and economical than a triumph by superior force. This approach minimizes bloodshed and preserves resources. It's a truly ingenious, almost philosophical approach to power.
And this concept of she seems central to all of this, doesn't it? This ever-changing configuration of forces. It sounds like an almost fluid approach to power.
She is absolutely crucial, and it's a concept that has deeply influenced Chinese strategic thinking for millennia, right up to the present day. The term connotes the ever-changing configuration of forces, as well as their general trend. To Sun Tzu, A strategist mastering Xi is akin to water flowing downhill, automatically finding the swiftest and easiest course. A successful commander doesn't charge headlong into battle. He shies away from an enemy's strength. He spends his time observing and cultivating changes in the strategic landscape, studying the enemy's preparations and morale, husbanding resources, and playing on psychological weaknesses. Only then, at the opportune moment, does he strike at the weakest point, deploying resources swiftly and suddenly, rushing downhill along the path of least resistance. So the profound takeaway from Xi isn't just about winning battles, it's about setting up the entire situation so skillfully that the other side essentially defeats themselves, or that a battle becomes entirely unnecessary. This is a doctrine less of territorial conquest than of psychological dominance, a principle you can see echoed in later Chinese military strategy, even by North Vietnam against America, though Hanoi often translated psychological gains into territorial ones. It's a long game, played with immense patience.
So imagine this ancient, self-contained civilization, confident in its own supremacy and guided by these patient, indirect strategic principles. What happens then when it crashes head-on with the expanding Western powers, who operate on a completely different set of rules, driven by trade, technological innovation, and a more direct, often forceful approach?
This collision was, in many ways, inevitable, and it imposed some of the most wrenching strains on Chinese society. China was a state claiming universal relevance for its culture, but it was also largely indifferent to foreign trade and technological innovation. It was caught completely unawares by the Western age of exploration and, critically, by the Industrial Revolution that powered Europe's rise to global dominance. The technological and philosophical gaps were immense.
And the first major attempt by the British to bridge this diplomatic gulf was the Macartney mission, wasn't it? How did that play out from China's perspective, given their all-under-heaven worldview?
Think about this. Britain, a rising global power, sent not one but two high-level diplomatic missions in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. First Lord George Macartney in 1793 to 94, then Lord Amherst in 1816, simply seeking standard diplomatic relations and free trade on equal terms. Both failed spectacularly because China viewed them not as equals, but as lesser states coming to pay tribute. Macartney, a seasoned diplomat, requested a permanent British ambassador and other trade concessions. Early in the morning of October 3, 1793, he was summoned to receive the emperor's answer. He was ushered up a staircase where a letter sat, to which Chinese officials kowtowed. The emperor's edict to King George III was profoundly humiliating. You, O king, live beyond the confines of many seas. Nevertheless, impelled by your humble desire to partake of the benefits of our civilization, you have dispatched a mission respectfully bearing your memorial. Every substantive request was dismissed, including a permanent ambassador, as contrary to all usage of my dynasty. Foreign envoys, the edict implied, were simply supposed to come to be transformed by the emperor's civilizing influence. Lord Amherst's mission in 1816 faced a similar standoff over the kowtow and was abruptly dismissed, with Britain's Prince Regent commanded to endeavor with obedience to make progress towards civilized transformation. This wasn't just a minor diplomatic snub, it was a fundamental clash of worldviews, with China utterly unwilling to recognize any external equal.
And this leads, inevitably, to the Opium Wars. It feels like a clash of fundamental misunderstandings and a brutal exposure of technological disparities.
It was precisely that. The British East India Company began selling opium to China to balance their trade deficit, leading to widespread addiction and a massive outflow of silver. When Chinese official Lin Zexu, a highly principled and capable commissioner, was sent to halt the opium trade, he dramatically overestimated China's leverage. In his ultimatum to the British, he genuinely believed Westerners were existentially dependent on Chinese products like tea and rhubarb. He asked, if China cuts off these benefits, then what can the barbarians rely upon to keep themselves alive? He saw foreign manufactured goods as toys, and China, with its vast resources and self-sufficiency, had nothing to fear from retaliation. But British opinion treated the destruction of British opium stores and the siege of their community as an unacceptable affront, leading to a declaration of war and demands for territory.
And the technological gap, which China had so long ignored, must have become shockingly clear very quickly.
Vast and devastatingly so. Chinese officials like Viceroy Qishan quickly recognized the disparity, noting British steam vessels glide along against the current and are capable of fantastic speed, and their carriages are mounted on swivels, referring to their advanced artillery. In stark contrast, China's guns were often centuries old, from the Ming Dynasty, and military officials were predominantly literary officials with no knowledge of armaments. The emperor, seemingly unaware of this gulf, initially instructed Qishan to engage in prolonged negotiation to weary the British before a sudden decisive attack. This naivety was brutally exposed. The Treaty of Nanjing in 1842 forced China into major concessions, including the cession of Hong Kong. This was followed by the 1858 Treaty of Tianjin, which included the right to a permanent embassy in Beijing, opened more treaty ports where foreign trade and residence were permitted, and protected Christian proselytizing, a particularly difficult concession for the Qing dynasty, given the ongoing Taiping Rebellion, which drew on quasi-Christian ideology. Crucially, the most favored nation clause ensured any concession to one power extended to all others, further eroding Chinese sovereignty and preventing China from playing powers off each other.
It sounds like China was in an impossible situation, caught between its ancient worldview and a new, brutal reality. How did they try to adapt to this, particularly with strategies like self-strengthening and the fascinating concept of using barbarians against barbarians?
Faced with such humiliation and the clear technological inferiority, China debated self-strengthening. Many of the Confucian elite and conservative populace feared that importing foreign technology, especially military technology, would endanger China's cultural essence and social order, unquote. Modernizing along Western lines was seen by some as ceasing to be Chinese, unquote. But this is where Chinese ingenuity came into play, drawing on their long historical memory. The strategist Wei Yuan, citing ancient precedents of clever manipulation, proposed using barbarians against barbarians. He surveyed the globe for enemy countries of which the British barbarians are afraid, identifying Russia, France, and America. His novel idea was to invite other barbarians into China and to set up a contest between their greed and Britain's so that China could emerge as the balancer. Rather than let Britain benefit alone, China should strategically offer concessions to all rapacious nations, thereby creating competition among them.
So they were essentially turning the West's own tools, its competitive nature and desire for access, against itself. That's quite clever and very much in line with Sun Tzu's indirect approach.
It was remarkably clever indeed, and a direct application of that Wei-Qi strategic mindset we discussed earlier. The most favored nation clause, initially a tool of Western exaction, was later used by Chinese diplomacy to limit exactions by stimulating competition between the various claimants for special privilege. Prince Gong's policy in 1861 embodied this. Resort to peace and friendship when temporarily obliged to do so. Use war and defense as your actual policy. His priorities were clear. Suppress domestic rebellions first, then get Russia under control and attend to Britain last. A remarkable anecdote here is the career of Li Hongzhang, a key Mandarin who served as China's de facto foreign minister for nearly 4 decades. He exemplified this complex, pragmatic diplomacy. He allied with Western forces, including British General Charles Chinese Gordon, against internal threats like the devastating Taiping Rebellion, which almost brought down the Qing dynasty. His efforts demonstrated a remarkable ability to navigate between and usually mitigate late Qing China's severely unattractive alternatives. Though he was stripped of his rank 3 times during his career, he was always recalled because no one else possessed his diplomatic skills and understanding of the foreign powers.
That's a powerful illustration of the dire straits China was in. But did this strategy of using barbarians against barbarians actually work in the long run, or did it have its own significant costs?
It had both tactical successes and strategic costs. For instance, Russia exacted a staggering territorial price for its services, gaining 350,000 square miles of territory along the Pacific coast, including the port of Vladivostok, and later control over Manchuria through a secret railway agreement. Japan, too, after its modernization, defeated China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894-95, gaining Taiwan and significant influence over Korea. While China did manage to avoid outright colonization and maintain its sovereignty, it was often by making painful concessions to one power to avoid worse outcomes from another. Ultimately, the U.S. open door policy, proclaimed in 1899, originally sought to gain for the United States the benefits of other countries' imperialism, but by the 1930s it was transformed into a means to preserve China's independence. It was a long, painful, and often humiliating process for China to enter the modern world, fundamentally reshaping its self-perception from the center of the universe to a nation struggling for survival.
From the ashes of imperial collapse, China rises as a communist state. But under Mao, China is transformed in a uniquely Chinese way, often drawing on those same ancient strategic principles we just discussed. How did Mao, a revolutionary leader, surprisingly fuse radical ideology with ancient thought to assert China's power in the Cold War?
It's truly remarkable how deep the historical currents ran, even through a revolutionary like Mao. His revolution was, by design, a country in permanent crisis, seeking a vague, great harmony through brutal tests and upheavals. Yet he often framed his foreign policy doctrines in terms of analogies with highly traditional Chinese games of the intellect, fundamentally relying on a unique strategic approach rooted in history. Mao vowed China was to be smashed like an atom to unleash its power, a version of the Confucian tradition through the looking glass, proclaiming a total break from the past while paradoxically relying on traditional institutions like an imperial style of governance and the state as an ethical project. He saw his role as diametrically opposite to Confucius. The Great Harmony came at the end of a painful process, likely to claim as victims all who traversed it. Mao believed Confucian order kept China weak, and that true progress came through brutal tests and continuous struggle. He aimed for psychological equivalence to superpowers through a calculated indifference to their military capabilities.
That's a fascinating reinterpretation. He's taking the idea of radical change, but still through a very Chinese lens. And he even drew on specific ancient strategies, didn't he? It's not just a general influence, but a very literal application.
Indeed. One classic tale he frequently invokes was Zhuge Liang's empty city stratagem, where a commander, faced with a superior army, feigns weakness, leaving his city gates open and playing music from the ramparts, to deter attack by making the enemy suspect an ambush. Mao adapted this, proposing to achieve psychological equivalence to the nuclear superpowers by his calculated indifference to their military capabilities, essentially projecting an image of fearlessness despite weakness. He also trained his top associates and even his doctor in strategic thinking through traditional games like Weiqi, the Chinese board game that emphasizes surrounding an opponent and accumulating relative advantage rather than head-on collision, and Mahjong for understanding probability and certainty. He saw the world, particularly superpower interactions, through the lens of Weiqi, aiming to prevent strategic encirclement of China by subtly disrupting his adversary's calculations and accumulating small advantages. Even his own purged PLA marshals, when asked to analyze China's strategic options in 1969, bravely recommended opening relations with the U.S. by citing The Romance of the Three Kingdoms, a book banned in China at the time. This demonstrates how deeply ingrained these historical and literary allusions were in Chinese strategic thought across all political divides.
And the Korean War, it seems, was a perfect, brutal example of this Weiqi strategy in action, leading to a clash that was profoundly shaped by differing strategic designs.
It was. When American forces intervened in the Taiwan Strait, Mao saw it as placing two stones on the Weiqi board, which directly menaced China with the dreaded encirclement of its vital industrial heartland in Manchuria. This led to a clash by misinterpreting each other's strategic design. Kissinger notes, China entered the war based on a carefully considered assessment of strategic trends, not as a reaction to an American tactical maneuver. End quote. Mao's insistence on intervention was also paradoxically in part to protect himself against Soviet designs. End quote. Stalin, ever the manipulator, had encouraged Kim Il-sung's invasion of South Korea, but then explicitly shifted responsibility to China, telling Kim, if you should get kicked in the teeth, I shall not lift a finger. You have to ask Mao for all the help. End quote. Mao thus felt compelled to intervene, facing the choice between an American army on the Yalu River threatening Chinese industry or a disgruntled Soviet Union withholding crucial aid and potentially undermining his leadership.
He also engaged in some serious strategic brinkmanship during the Taiwan Strait crises, particularly with nuclear threats, during a time when China was still incredibly vulnerable. That sounds incredibly dangerous.
It was, and it was a calculated risk. In 1954-55, Mao challenged the U.S. with a massive shelling campaign on the offshore islands of Quemoy and Matsu, which China viewed as integral to its sovereignty. The U.S., with Eisenhower's authorization, made a specific nuclear threat to defend Taiwan. Mao's response was chillingly dismissive, a classic application of his calculated indifference. The United States cannot annihilate the Chinese nation with its small stack of atom bombs, even if the U.S. atom bombs were so powerful that they would make a hole right through the Earth. That would hardly mean anything to the universe as a whole. End quote. He declared that China, with its Millet-plus rifles, was sure to emerge the victor. During the Second Taiwan Strait crisis in 1958, Mao resumed shelling on odd-numbered days, a deliberately peculiar rhythm that made it clear this was a political battle, rather than conventional military strategy. This nuclear brinkmanship profoundly unsettled Moscow, which feared being dragged into a wider war, leading to a suspension of nuclear cooperation in 1959 and a withdrawal of Soviet aid in 1960. Mao's actions demonstrated China's hair-trigger response to perceived threats, though it also led to China's progressive isolation for a decade and a half from both superpowers.
This friction with the Soviet Union ultimately led to the Sino-Soviet split, a massive geopolitical shift. What was the core of that disagreement beyond just ideological posturing?
The core of the disagreement went deep, touching on both ideology and national interest. Mao asserted China's unique path to socialism as superior, rejecting Soviet economic models and what he saw as Khrushchev's revisionism and deviation from true Marxist-Leninist principles. He transformed practical differences into profound philosophical ones, arguing that China had done better than the Soviet Union in upholding revolutionary purity. The breaking point came when Mao reacted furiously to Khrushchev's proposals for Soviet use of Chinese ports for submarines, viewing it as a profound violation of Chinese sovereignty. He famously declared, "We've had the British and other foreigners on our territory for years now, and we're not ever going to let anyone use our land for their own purposes again." It was the last time Mao and Khrushchev would meet. What's amazing is that for another 10 years, despite mounting Sino-Soviet tensions, border clashes, and a fierce ideological rivalry, the world largely treated it as a family quarrel, rather than an existential battle that would fundamentally reshape the Cold War landscape.
And then, while all this is happening, he launches the Cultural Revolution. To an outside observer, this seems like an almost incomprehensible act of self-destruction, dismantling the very institutions that held the country together. What was the internal logic behind such a cataclysmic event?
It truly was a cataclysm. From 1966 to 1976, Mao chose to smash the Chinese state and the Communist Party in a final assault on the stubborn remnants of traditional Chinese culture and on perceived bourgeois elements within the party. The result was spectacular human and institutional carnage. Universities closed, experts were suspect and persecuted, children were turned against their parents, with students brutalizing teachers and burning books. China became an upside-down world. Its diplomatic posture came unhinged, raging indiscriminately against the Soviet bloc, Western powers, in its own history. Almost all Chinese diplomats were recalled, with only one ambassador remaining abroad in Cairo. China became embroiled in disputes with dozens of countries. Mao's commitment to self-reliance even precluded any admission of dependence on foreign assistance. He famously rejected a U.S. food for peace offer during a famine, insisting China was overcoming its difficulties by its own efforts. Despite this self-inflicted travail, China still managed to fight wars, challenge superpowers, and restore its frontiers, emerging almost miraculously as a geopolitical free agent in the Cold War, ready to play the great powers off each other. The internal chaos and suffering were immense, but Mao seemed to view it as a necessary cleansing fire to prevent the revolution from stagnating.
20 years of hostile silence broken by secret overtures. This is one of the most unexpected diplomatic breakthroughs in modern history. How did Nixon and Mao, two such fundamentally different leaders, one a cold warrior from the West, the other a revolutionary Marxist from the East, manage to forge this new path after so much animosity?
This was a profound moment, driven by cold strategic calculus rather than any ideological shifts or newfound affection. Mao, facing a growing Soviet threat along his northern border, subtly signaled a new approach, and Nixon, seeking to reorder international relations and extricate the U.S. from Vietnam, seized the opportunity. What's remarkable is how early Mao began to hint at this. Beginning in 1965, he subtly altered his tone towards America. Off their interviews with American journalist Edgar Snow, he conveyed a kind of resignation from the traditional communist doctrine of world revolution, stating, "Wherever there is revolution, we will issue statements, but we will not send in troops." This was a quiet signal that China was less interested in exporting revolution and more focused on its own national security.
And then, in 1969, Mao even posed a strategic riddle to his doctor, essentially laying out the logic for reaching out to the United States. It sounds like he was thinking several steps ahead, like a game of Wakeley.
It's exactly like Wakey. He famously asked his doctor, "Think about this. We have the Soviet Union to the north and the west, India to the south, and Japan to the east. If all our enemies were to unite, attacking us from the north, south, east, and west, what do you think we should do?" End quote. When his interlocutor was stumped, Mao continued, offering the solution rooted in ancient Chinese wisdom. Didn't our ancestors counsel negotiating with faraway countries while fighting with those that are near? Clearly indicating the United States, which was geographically distant, as the faraway country to align with against the immediate threat of the Soviet Union. Even purged PLA marshals, tasked by Mao to analyze strategic options, came to a similar conclusion, recommending opening relations with the U.S. They correctly identified the Soviet Union as the principal danger and saw the U.S. as sitting on top of the mountain to watch a fight between two tigers, a classic Chinese idiom for waiting for adversaries to weaken each other. They bravely recommended resuming ambassadorial talks with the U.S., even dropping the Taiwan precondition, which was a politically risky move for them at the time.
On the American side, Nixon's vision was equally pragmatic, wasn't it? He wasn't driven by ideology, but by a cold assessment of the national interest.
Absolutely. Nixon sought to end the Vietnam War responsibly and, crucially, to reshape the international order from a bipolar world dominated by two superpowers into a multipolar one where the U.S., USSR, China, Japan, and Western Europe could balance each other. He grounded American foreign policy firmly in the national interest, moving away from purely ideological crusades. It was a revolutionary moment in U.S. foreign policy. An American president declared that we had a strategic interest in the survival of a major communist country with which we had had no meaningful contact for 20 years. Quote, Nixon emphasized that complete candor was a precondition for genuine cooperation. It is important we develop complete candor and recognize that neither of us would do anything unless we considered it was in our interests. Quote, this profound pragmatism shared by both leaders was key to bridging the vast ideological chasm that separated their nations.
And the way this breakthrough happened was through these incredibly intricate secret channels. It sounds less like diplomacy and more like a carefully choreographed ballet.
It truly was an intricate minuet of secret exchanges via intermediaries like Pakistan and Romania. Beijing subtly signaled willingness to discuss relations outside formal channels without Taiwan as a precondition, which had been a major hurdle. Mao himself told Edgar Snow he was ending the Cultural Revolution, deploring the cult of personality and fighting, hoping for mutual respect and equality between Chinese and Americans. This set the stage for Kissinger's secret visit in July 1971. The Chinese meticulously planned every detail. The hosts designed a leisurely schedule to signal they were in no particular hurry, a typical Chinese tactic to convey confidence and avoid appearing overly eager. Zhu Enlai, China's premier and Kissinger's primary interlocutor, despite his higher rank, made the first call on Kissinger, a gesture of considerable courtesy, which was highly unusual protocol and a deliberate signal of respect. In their discussions, Zhu subtly conveyed that China had overcome its internal turmoil and was now a united, reliable partner, especially against the looming Soviet threat. He even boasted that, although all under the heavens is in great chaos, the situation is wonderful. A seemingly paradoxical statement that was a way to elicit American attitudes without appearing to ask for help, turning China's recent chaos into a sign of strength and internal unity. Zhu also framed the emerging relationship as a friendship, albeit a hard-headed, unsentimental one, stressing long-term cultural and national ties over individual qualities. He even tried to confer on America a history longer than China's in some ways, while simultaneously highlighting China's unique 4,000-year written language history. And crucially, he affirmed that China would absolutely not become a superpower, advocating for equality among all countries. This careful signaling and masterful diplomacy laid the groundwork.
Then came the actual Nixon summit in 1972, with the iconic meeting between Nixon and Mao. How did Mao's unique personality and diplomatic style come across in those pivotal meetings? He wasn't exactly known for straightforward conversation, was he?
Not at all. Mao's meeting with Nixon occurred almost immediately upon arrival, as if events of nature, echoing how emperors granted audiences rather than equals meeting for negotiations. It provided a direct introduction to Mao's famous bantering and elliptical style of conversation. He was Socratic, asking probing questions, full of sarcastic remarks and observations, rarely making direct, binding commitments. He famously stated, pointing to Kissinger, "Seize the hour and seize the day," a quote from an ancient poem urging immediate action. He dismissed the notion of engaging in philosophical debate with Nixon, jokingly deflecting to Kissinger as the only doctor of philosophy available. He even joked with a wry smile, "If all of you were overthrown, we wouldn't have any more friends left," underscoring the non-ideological, purely transactional basis of their new relationship. This sardonic wit often masked deeper strategic points, leaving his interlocutors to puzzle out the real meaning.
And the drafting of the Shanghai Communique, which was supposed to be a standard diplomatic document, turned into something quite different, didn't it? Mao seemed to relish throwing out the traditional rulebook.
Indeed. Mao intervened directly in the drafting of the Shanghai Communique, the joint statement outlining the principles of the new relationship. He reportedly called an early draft a bullshit communique because it tried to gloss over differences with bland, agreeable language. He insisted on a revolutionary approach, explicitly restating communist orthodoxies as the Chinese position, with the Americans stating theirs separately, side by side. For Mao, peace could emerge only out of struggle, not as an end in itself. He wasn't afraid to avow fundamental differences, believing that genuine understanding and progress could only come from acknowledging where they stood apart. This contrasted sharply with the American diplomatic approach, which often preferred specific practical agreements and felt an obligation to break deadlocks with new proposals. Chinese negotiators, conversely, used diplomacy to weave together political, military, and psychological elements into an overall strategic design, making time their ally and showing no emotional difficulty with deadlocks. It reflected that deep strategic patience.
So all this led to what Kissinger termed a quasi-alliance strategic cooperation without a formal treaty with a lot of ambiguity built in. What were the parameters and inherent paradoxes of this unique arrangement?
Yes, this period established strategic cooperation without a formal alliance, reflecting China's deeply ingrained commitment to self-reliance. Mao explicitly delinked the Taiwan issue from overall U.S.-China relations for diplomatic purposes, stating, "The question of the U.S. relations with us should be separate from that of our relations with Taiwan." However, he warned, regarding Beijing's relations with Taiwan, "I do not believe in a peaceful transition." He even humorously suggested to Kissinger he would tell God it's better to have Taiwan under the care of the United States now, implying no immediate time pressure for Beijing to resolve the issue by force. This was a masterclass in strategic ambiguity. China consistently insisted it did not need protection and could handle crises alone, despite its very real military weakness at the time, stressing digging tunnels and surviving on rifles and millet. This bombast was likely calculated to mask China's vulnerability while simultaneously reinforcing its unwavering commitment to self-reliance and independence. Mao also famously critiqued the U.S. doctrine of mutual assured destruction, MAD, the concept that a nuclear attack by either superpower would inevitably lead to the total annihilation of both, telling Kissinger, "You have confidence in, you believe in nuclear weapons. You do not have confidence in your own army." This quasi-alliance was founded on exploiting overlapping hostilities between the superpowers, with China playing a geopolitical free agent role, using its unique position to gain leverage against the Soviet Union. It was a strategy born of necessity, but executed with immense diplomatic skill and a profound understanding of leverage and Sun Tzu's principles of indirect engagement.
From the revolutionary era and Mao's complex legacy, a new leader emerges, Deng Xiaoping. He leads China away from continuous revolution and towards a path that will fundamentally redefine its future and place in the world. But this transformation, while epochal, was far from smooth. What was the essence of Deng's pragmatic approach, and how did it set China on a completely different trajectory?
Deng's return from internal exile marked a profound shift for China. He was a pragmatist through and through, less interested in grand philosophy or continuous ideological struggle than in practical results and measurable progress. His speeches, unlike Mao's sweeping pronouncements, were technical, not transcendent. Focusing on concrete details like military discipline and railway efficiency, his core mission was clear: to modernize China and, in doing so, regain its preeminence in the world. This involved embracing market forces cautiously while navigating immense domestic tensions and the legacy of Mao's radicalism. Deng reinvented Mao's legacy, stating that Mao was 70% correct and 30% wrong, a politically brilliant maneuver that allowed him to move past the Cultural Revolution without completely repudiating Mao, thus preserving party legitimacy. He definitively abandoned continuous revolution and instead emphasized that practice is the sole criterion for testing truth, a philosophical pivot that opened the door to economic experimentation. He argued that when thinking turns rigid and blind faith is the fashion, it is impossible for a party or a nation to make progress. He then boldly revived Zhou Enlai's long-dormant proposal for comprehensive modernization in 4 key sectors: agriculture, industry, national defense, and science and technology. This was China's blueprint for the future.
So, after the Vietnam War and the shifting Cold War dynamics, China's strategic outlook shifted dramatically, didn't it? Especially regarding its relationship with the U.S. and its immediate neighbors.
It absolutely did. The normalization of relations with the U.S. was completed under Jimmy Carter, despite the U.S. passing the Taiwan Relations Act, which allowed for continued, albeit unofficial, U.S. arms sales to Taiwan. This was a compromise both sides accepted for a greater strategic purpose. Critically, China, under Deng, viewed a unified communist Vietnam, now backed by the Soviet Union, as a greater strategic threat than the U.S. This aligned perfectly with the permanent Chinese fear of encirclement that runs through their strategic history. Preventing an Indo-China bloc linked to the Soviet Union became paramount. To rally international support and signal China's new strategic alignment, Deng undertook a series of highly visible diplomatic journeys to Southeast Asia, the U.S., and Japan in 1978-79. This was a dramatic shift from previous Chinese support for revolutionary movements in those regions. Now he was gathering support for punishing Vietnam.
And China actually launched a significant military operation against Vietnam, didn't it? That must have been a huge risk, testing the new relationship with the U.S. and the limits of Soviet patience.
Yes, it was. In February 1979, China mounted a self-defensive counterattack against Vietnam with over 200,000 PLA soldiers. This was not a conquest. It was a carefully limited, punitive war, demonstrating a Chinese version of deterrence, meant to teach Vietnam a lesson for its invasion of Cambodia and its alignment with Moscow. What's remarkable is that Deng predicted correctly that the Soviet Union would not launch a full-scale attack in response, despite their treaty with Vietnam. Kissinger himself observed that this marked the beginning of an, at first gradual, then accelerating Soviet decline, as Moscow's inability to protect its ally exposed its weakening global reach. Furthermore, the U.S. and China engaged in de facto cooperation on aid to the Cambodian resistance, which controversially included remnants of the Khmer Rouge through Thailand to counter Vietnamese occupation of Cambodia. American officials were careful to stress they cannot support Pol Pot, but the aid flow continued, illustrating the profoundly pragmatic, often uncomfortable alignment of interests.
What about the challenge of Taiwan arms sales, especially with a president like Reagan who had strong personal ties and ideological commitment to Taiwan? That must have been a constant source of tension.
It was indeed a significant challenge. Reagan's strong personal attachment to Taiwan and his campaigned rhetoric of restoring full diplomatic ties posed a real threat to the nascent U.S.-China relationship. His administration, however, under Secretary of State Alexander Haig, prioritized preserving China as a de facto U.S. ally against the Soviets. Haig sought ways for the U.S. to supply arms to both China and Taiwan, a complex diplomatic tightrope walk. China ultimately went along with ambiguous language on Taiwan in the Third Communique in 1982, understanding that cooperation with the U.S., particularly against the Soviet threat, fulfilled its other national purposes and its broader modernization goals. With Soviet weakness becoming increasingly apparent, the U.S. sought an offensive posture, while China shrewdly sought to recalibrate the global equilibrium, reasserting its freedom of maneuver. Deng transformed Mao's horizontal line concept into a three-worlds approach, effectively categorizing the world into the two superpowers, US, USSR, the developed world and the developing world, with China seeing itself as part of and a leader within the developing world, thereby enhancing its leverage and independence. China, under Deng, consistently adhered to self-reliance, moral aloofness, and superiority in its foreign policy, even as it opened economically.
But this era of pragmatic reform and opening wasn't without its massive internal struggles, culminating in the horrific events of Tiananmen Square in 1989. What happened there, and what were the profound consequences, both domestically and internationally?
The shift from central planning to a market economy, particularly with the introduction of a two-price system for goods, inadvertently opened vast avenues for corruption and nepotism. This created deep discontent among losers in the new system, and, paradoxically, raised expectations for greater personal liberties among those who benefited. The Chinese leadership became profoundly divided, with Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, Glasnost perestroika, serving as both a dangerous heresy to some and a potential model to others. In April 1989, the death of Hu Yaobang, a liberal-leaning former party general secretary, sparked spontaneous protests. These quickly escalated into the occupation of Tiananmen Square, with students voicing widespread frustration over corruption, inflation, and the lack of political liberalization. After weeks of internal debate and division within the party, Deng and the Politburo ordered the People's Liberation Army to clear the square on June 4th, resulting in a harsh suppression, all witnessed live on television by media from around the world. The human cost was devastating, and the image of a single man standing before a tank became iconic.
The international reaction was incredibly strong, putting the U.S. in a difficult position, caught between its stated values and its strategic interests. How did the Bush administration navigate that?
The international reaction was stark, with China branded an arbitrary authoritarian state and facing widespread condemnation and sanctions. The U.S. faced a profound dilemma between upholding human rights, idealism, and maintaining strategic interest, realism, with China, particularly given its role against the Soviet Union. President George H.W. Bush, having served as the first U.S. envoy to Beijing, understood Chinese sensitivities acutely. He appealed to Deng as a friend, stressing American idealism and the profound public outrage in the U.S., while simultaneously urging China to understand the pressure he was under. Deng's response, quoting a classical Chinese proverb, was direct. "It is up to the person who tied the knot to untie it, meaning the U.S. was responsible for improving relations. He vowed to punish those instigators of the rebellion, stating, "Otherwise, how can the PRC continue to exist?" A particularly thorny issue was the physicist Fang Lizi and his wife, who sought refuge in the U.S. Embassy, becoming a high-profile wedge that symbolized the human rights struggle. Deng proposed Fang write a confession, or that the U.S. guarantee he wouldn't make anti-PRC remarks if allowed to leave, becoming part of a complex package deal to normalize relations and get Fang out of the embassy.
And after Tiananmen, Deng left his successors with a crucial, almost poetic piece of strategic advice, didn't he? A maxim that continues to resonate today.
Yes, absolutely. Deng's ultimate maxim for his successors, particularly after Tiananmen and the collapse of the Soviet Union shortly thereafter, was delivered in classical Chinese poetic style: hide our capacities and bide our time, and never claim leadership. This instruction, often translated as Dou Guangyang Hui, was meant to guide China through a perceived period of weakness, urging caution and restraint on the global stage. But it could also be interpreted as a permanent maxim against excessive assertiveness, even when China grew strong. It was a profound reflection on China's unique position in the world and how it should conduct itself in a shifting global landscape, a strategic patience that goes back to Sun Tzu.
As we leave the 20th century and enter the new millennium, China has not only survived, it has surged onto the global stage with unprecedented speed. How does this rising power navigate a world where its unique history, strategic patience, and distinct conceptual framework clash with Western norms of rapid action and universal values?
Yeah.
What does it mean for the future of U.S.-China relations?
The end of Jiang Zemin's presidency marked a significant shift from a dialogue focused primarily on the U.S.-China relationship itself to one of cooperative coexistence, without a common adversary or a joint concept of world order. China is undeniably arriving as a great power, but it grapples with immense internal complexities and external challenges, even now. Jiang Zemin, described as an affable family member, unlike his more aloof predecessors, guided China to a stunning explosion of energy and creativity, overseeing unprecedented GDP growth during his tenure. He masterminded China's reintegration into the global economy, culminating in his crucial entry into the WTO in 2001 and Beijing hosting the Olympics in 2008, both of which profoundly restored international confidence in China's trajectory. Jiang famously affirmed that China would absolutely not become a superpower, advocating for equality among all countries and non-interference in internal affairs, a line that many still question today. The 1999 U.S. bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade during the Kosovo War sparked widespread outrage in China, with Jiang declaring, "The great People's Republic of China will never be bullied." Despite these tensions, China became an independent proponent of its own solutions and a source of emergency assistance during the 1997-98 Asian financial crisis, demonstrating its growing influence.
And the next generation of leaders, Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao, seem to emphasize stability even more, focusing on a harmonious society. How did that domestic focus translate into their foreign policy?
They did. These leaders, the first without direct experience of the revolution, emphasized normalcy and stability, focusing on achieving a harmonious society domestically and contributing to a harmonious world internationally. Their foreign policy aimed for a peaceful international environment and, crucially, ensured access to raw materials and markets for continued economic growth. They maintained a special interest in the developing world, a direct legacy of Mao's Three Worlds theory, even as China entered the ranks of economic superpowers. Interestingly, the rise of nuclear proliferation in North Korea created an ironic challenge, echoing the U.S.-China battlefield encounter over Korea 60 years prior, forcing them to cooperate on a long-standing point of tension. China identified a strategic opportunity period in the first 20 years of the 21st century for leaps and bounds development, but also recognized continuing vulnerabilities, acknowledging that despite its rise, it still had significant internal challenges. The 2008 global financial crisis, which originated in the West, caused some Chinese elites to challenge this gradualism, questioning whether the West would truly allow China to rise harmoniously without eventually seeking to contain it.
This sounds like an ongoing internal debate about China's fundamental place in the world. A national destiny debate, wrestling with ideas of triumphalism versus peaceful development, now from a position of immense strength. What are the core arguments within that debate, and how does it play out in their strategic thinking?
That's precisely what it is, and it's a critical lens through which to view modern China. This debate, now from a position of undeniable Chinese strength, is epitomized by books like China is Unhappy and China Dream. The triumphalist view, advocated by figures like Colonel Lu Mingfu in China Dream, argues that conflict is inherent in U.S.-China relations and that the relationship will be a marathon contest in the duel of the century. For them, the competition is zero-sum. If China in the 21st century cannot become world number one, cannot become the top power, then inevitably it will become a straggler that is cast aside. They champion the idea that China's rise is not just about economic power, but about reclaiming its historical preeminence, suggesting a more assertive, even confrontational stance against any perceived challengers, advocating for an unyielding pursuit of global leadership. However, on the other side, influential officials like Dai Binglu articulate a very different commitment to peaceful development. They argue it is not the product of a subjective imagination. Rather, it is the result of our profound recognition that both the world today and China today have undergone tremendous changes. This perspective emphasizes that China's rise must be peaceful because it's fundamentally in China's long-term interest and aligns with a more interconnected global reality. They contend that China's internal development needs a stable international environment and that a confrontational approach would ultimately undermine its own progress. This debate reflects the genuine tension within China's leadership and society about how to wield its newfound power.
So what does this all mean for the future of U.S.-China relations? How can these two vastly different approaches, one rooted in ancient patient strategy and self-perception, the other in a more pragmatic universalist impulse, coexist or even cooperate in an increasingly multipolar world?
Kissinger draws a historical comparison to pre-WWI Europe, where Germany's meteoric rise led to a zero-sum game, ultimately resulting in catastrophic conflict. However, he argues that U.S.-China relations need not and should not become a zero-sum game. He consistently highlights China's immense domestic challenges, which are often overlooked in triumphalist narratives. 150 million people below the UN poverty line, 40 million below China's own poverty line, 10 million without electricity, and a staggering 24 million new jobs needed annually just to absorb new entrants into the workforce. He notes China has a huge population and a weak foundation, with deeply uneven development between its prosperous coastal regions and its vast, poorer interior. Therefore, the crucial competition, Kissinger suggests, is likely to be primarily economic and social, not solely military. The U.S., he argues, has the capacity to arrest or reverse its own economic challenges, and should do so for its own convictions and national renewal, rather than viewing it solely as a contest with China. The path to cooperation for these two societies, representing different versions of exceptionalism, China with its ancient sense of centrality, and the U.S. with its universalist ideals, is inherently complex. The future of Asia, and indeed the world, will be profoundly shaped by their respective visions and their ability to find congruence with the other's historic regional role. This doesn't mean one side changing the other, but recognizing and respecting distinct historical perspectives. It requires leaders to establish a tradition of consultation and mutual respect, so that for their successors, jointly building a shared world order becomes an expression of parallel national aspirations. It's about finding a way to co-evolve, not converge, and understanding that patience, for both sides, will be key.
This deep dive into Kissinger's On China really underscores just how deeply history and a distinct conceptual framework influence China's interactions with the world. It's not about judging, but about understanding the profound, deeply ingrained patterns that shape a nation's soul. So what's the big takeaway, the thought that should linger with you, our listener, long after this deep dive ends?
This raises an important question. The consistent thread through China's history, from its imperial all-under-heaven diplomacy to Mao's Wei-Qi strategy and Deng's profound hide our capacities and bide our time maxim, is a deep-seated patience and an emphasis on subtle, indirect influence, all shaped by an enduring sense of being civilization itself. For you, the listener, the provocative thought is this. How can two nations, one steeped in this ancient, patient, and often indirect strategic tradition, and the other driven by an immediate, pragmatic, and universalist impulse, often seeking direct outcomes, find true common ground in a globalized world beyond mere transactional interests to build a stable and prosperous future for us all? Is it about finding true shared purpose or simply managing enduring differences with wisdom and patience?
A fascinating challenge to ponder. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a shortcut to being truly well-informed.